You think you know long-range shooting? Then tell me why the wind changed 3 times before your bullet even got there. The voice came from the back of the classroom, calm, steady, and completely unexpected. Every head turned at once. The Advanced Precision Marksmanship course at Fort Carson was known for attracting some of the most ambitious shooters in the country. Army instructors, Marine marksmen, law enforcement specialists, and military trainees all passed through its doors hoping to sharpen their skills. On that particular Tuesday morning, the classroom buzzed with confidence. Rows of students filled the seats while charts of ballistic trajectories and wind formulas covered the walls. At the front of the room stood Tyler Brooks, one of the youngest sniper instructors ever assigned to the program. At 29 years old, Tyler had built a reputation for being knowledgeable, articulate, and extremely confident in his abilities. Some people admired that confidence. Others quietly believed it had grown into something else. Tyler clicked to the next slide on the projector and crossed his arms. The biggest mistake most shooters make is thinking experience matters more than updated techniques, he said. The game changes. Equipment changes. Data changes. If you're still using methods from 15 years ago, you're already behind. Several students nodded. Tyler enjoyed moments like these. He enjoyed being the expert in the room. Near the back sat a woman who seemed completely out of place among the younger crowd. Rebecca Hayes wore a plain gray jacket, dark jeans, and simple hiking boots. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. She carried no military insignia, no rank, and no visible indication of any special background. To most people, she looked like someone's aunt who had wandered into the wrong building. Throughout the lecture, she quietly observed. She took no notes. She asked no questions. She simply watched. Tyler noticed her several times. Something about her expression bothered him. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't even pretending to be interested. She simply listened. That irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Let me ask you all something, Tyler said, pacing across the front of the room. How many of you think experience alone can compensate for outdated knowledge? A few students raised their hands. Rebecca didn't move. Tyler glanced directly at her. Ma'am, he said, you've been awfully quiet. The room shifted. Students turned toward her. Rebecca looked up calmly. I'm just listening. Tyler smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that appeared when someone believed they were about to prove a point. Well, maybe you can help us out, he said. You seem to have opinions. A few students chuckled. Rebecca remained composed. Not really. Come on, Tyler continued. You've been watching this entire lecture. Maybe you've got some wisdom to share. More laughter followed. Rebecca simply shrugged. I'm sure your students came here to hear you, not me. The response earned a few grins around the room. Tyler felt the room slipping away from him and immediately pushed back. That's all right, he said. Sometimes people learn best when they participate. He pointed toward the digital wind analysis display mounted beside the projector screen. Maybe later today I can teach you a few things about modern long-range shooting. The classroom laughed again. Rebecca offered a polite nod. Nothing more. But for the first time all morning, several students noticed something unusual. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look intimidated. She looked like someone who had heard the exact same speech many times before. And somehow, that made Tyler want to prove himself even more. The lecture ended 20 minutes later, but the atmosphere in the classroom felt different. Students gathered their notebooks and tablets while discussing ballistic software, wind formulas, and upcoming range exercises. Tyler remained near the front, answering questions and enjoying the attention that naturally followed a presentation. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. Rebecca Hayes was still there. Unlike everyone else, she seemed in no hurry. She quietly packed a small notebook into her bag and stood to leave. Ma'am, Tyler called out. The room grew quieter. Again, Rebecca stopped and turned. Yes. Tyler walked toward her with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. You never answered my question. A few students slowed down, pretending to organize their equipment while listening. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. Which question? Whether experience can replace modern knowledge. She gave a small smile. I do not think they compete with each other. Tyler folded his arms. That sounds like a diplomatic answer. Maybe it is just an honest one. Several students exchanged glances. Tyler sensed their attention and continued. You know, this course is designed for professionals. A lot of people come here believing old habits make them experts. Rebecca nodded politely. That happens. Sometimes they discover the field has changed. That also happens. Tyler waited for a reaction that never came. The woman seemed impossible to provoke. Most people eventually became defensive when challenged. Rebecca simply answered and moved on. Somehow that irritated him even more. Well, he said with a chuckle, you will probably enjoy this afternoon. We are running a live evaluation on the range. Real-world scenarios. Advanced wind reading. Long-distance engagement calculations. It tends to separate confidence from competence. Several students laughed softly. Rebecca remained calm. Sounds educational. It is. Tyler gestured toward the classroom door. You should stick around. You might learn something useful. This time the laughter was louder. Not cruel, but enough to make the point obvious. Rebecca looked around the room. Some students appeared uncomfortable. Others seemed amused. She simply nodded. I am always willing to learn. The response should have ended the conversation. Instead, it somehow made Tyler feel as though he had lost a round he could not explain. As Rebecca walked out, a former Marine named Chris Donovan stepped beside Tyler. You know her? Chris asked. No, she military? Tyler shrugged. Probably a retired administrator or somebody connected to the base. Chris glanced toward the hallway. She does not carry herself like an administrator. Tyler laughed. Everybody wants a mysterious backstory. Outside, the Colorado sun hung high above the training complex. Rebecca crossed the parking lot toward the range facilities. Along the way, she passed a display case mounted inside a nearby building. The glass contained photographs of former instructors, decorated marksmen, and notable graduates from decades of military marksmanship programs. Rebecca barely looked at it as she walked by. Had she stopped, she might have noticed that one of the oldest photographs on the wall was beginning to attract attention from a student who had seen her face somewhere before. He stared at the image for several seconds, feeling a strange sense of recognition he could not quite explain. By early afternoon, the training range was alive with activity. Pickup trucks moved between firing lanes. Instructors checked equipment. Students reviewed data cards while gusts of Colorado wind rolled across the open terrain. The mountains in the distance appeared sharp against the clear blue sky. Tyler Brooks stood beside a large digital display showing weather conditions in real time. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed updated every few seconds. It was exactly the kind of environment where he felt completely at home. The students gathered around as he explained the afternoon evaluation. This exercise is not about pulling a trigger, he said. It is about decision-making. Anybody can hit a target on a perfect day. Professionals succeed when conditions are unpredictable. Several students nodded and entered notes into their tablets. Tyler noticed Rebecca standing quietly near the rear of the group. She listened without writing anything down. Once again, that bothered him. Most visitors either asked endless questions or tried to impress people with stories. She did neither. We will start with wind assessment, Tyler continued. Everybody will submit a firing solution before touching a rifle. He pointed toward a steel target positioned far across the range. Heat waves shimmered above the ground between the firing line and the distant hillside. Target distance is 1,100 yards. A few students exchanged nervous looks. That was far enough to expose mistakes quickly. Tyler smiled. Let us see who has been paying attention. The students began calculating. Some used ballistic applications. Others relied on notebooks and range cards. Rebecca simply observed the terrain. Her eyes moved from the grass near the firing line to a cluster of trees halfway down range, and then toward the ridge line beyond the target. One student noticed. Are you not going to calculate? He asked. Rebecca smiled politely. Everybody has a process. Before the student could respond, Tyler stepped forward. Actually, that is a good question. The group turned toward him. Since our guest is here to learn, maybe she would like to participate. Several students glanced between them. The tone sounded friendly, but something underneath it felt different. Rebecca remained calm. I am happy to watch. Watching only gets you so far, Tyler replied. At some point you have to test your assumptions. A few students laughed. Rebecca nodded once. Fair enough. Tyler handed her a blank worksheet. Tell you what. Fill this out. Give us your best estimate. He clearly expected hesitation. Instead, Rebecca accepted the paper and thanked him. The students returned to their calculations. Minutes later, Tyler began collecting answers. Some estimates were close. Others were clearly affected by the changing wind. Then he reached Rebecca's worksheet. His eyes narrowed slightly. The numbers looked different from nearly every other submission. Interesting, he said. Very interesting. Several students leaned forward. What did she put? Somebody asked. Tyler folded the paper and smiled. We will find out soon enough. Across the range, the wind shifted again. Rebecca noticed it immediately. Tyler did not notice that she had noticed. And that small detail was about to matter far more than anyone realized. The firing line settled into a tense silence as Tyler organized the next phase of the evaluation. One by one, students moved through the exercise, presenting their calculations before discussing the reasoning behind them. The afternoon wind continued to drift across the range in uneven patterns. Small flags positioned at different distances rarely agreed with each other. Some pointed left, others barely moved. A few seemed to change direction every minute. It was exactly the kind of day that rewarded patience and punished assumptions. Tyler stood beside the digital display with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Each student explained a solution. Tyler offered corrections, observations, and occasional praise. The process reinforced his reputation as the expert in charge. Eventually, he reached the folded worksheet he had collected from Rebecca. He held it between two fingers and looked toward the group. Now this one is interesting, he said. Several students immediately turned toward Rebecca. She remained relaxed, standing near the rear of the gathering with her hands resting loosely at her sides. Tyler opened the paper and glanced down. A slight smile appeared on his face. Well, this is certainly different. A few people laughed. How different? One student asked. Tyler raised the worksheet. Most of you calculated for the average conditions visible from the firing line. He tapped the page. This solution assumes 3 separate wind zones along the bullet path. The students exchanged confused looks. One of them frowned. 3. Another shook his head. I only identified 2. Tyler nodded dramatically. Exactly. He turned toward Rebecca. That is a very creative theory. The word creative hung in the air longer than it needed to. Several students smiled. Rebecca simply listened. Would you like to explain it? Tyler asked. Not particularly, she answered. The response triggered a few quiet chuckles. Tyler seemed encouraged. Come on. Help us understand. Rebecca looked downrange for a moment before speaking. The grass near the firing point is moving differently than the vegetation halfway to the target. The ridgeline beyond the target is producing another pattern altogether. Some students glanced toward the distant terrain. Others squinted at the flags. Tyler folded his arms. And you are certain of that? No, Rebecca replied. I am never certain. I am only paying attention. The answer caught several people off guard. Tyler smiled again, but this. Tummet looked slightly forced. Paying attention is important. Data is better. Usually, Rebecca said. More students were listening now, not because of the disagreement itself, but because of how calm she remained. Every attempt to challenge her seemed to disappear into the same quiet confidence. Tyler stepped closer. You know, there is a reason we teach standardized methods. Experience can create bad habits. That is true, Rebecca said. It can also create useful ones. A few students exchanged glances. Chris Donovan lowered his notebook and watched the conversation carefully. The balance in the group was beginning to shift. Tyler could feel it. He cleared his throat and pointed toward the distant steel target. Good. Then let us test those habits. We are moving to practical application. Excitement spread through the class immediately. This was the part everyone had been waiting for. Theories would become results. Calculations would face reality. As students began preparing equipment, Tyler glanced at Rebecca one more time. He still believed he was teaching a lesson. What he did not realize was that several people around him had started wondering whether the lesson was aimed at the wrong person. Students moved toward the firing positions carrying rifles, data books, and spotting equipment. The mood had changed from casual discussion to focused anticipation. Conversations became quieter as everyone prepared to test their calculations against the conditions stretching across the range. Tyler walked confidently between the lanes, checking setups and offering last-minute advice. He enjoyed this part of the course because results were visible. Numbers either worked or they did not. Assumptions either held up or they failed. There was nowhere to hide once the exercise began. Rebecca stood off to the side, watching the activity without inserting herself into it. She looked less like a visitor and more like someone observing a familiar routine. Chris Donovan noticed it too. You really are not going to participate? He asked. Rebecca smiled slightly. I was not invited here to compete. Before Chris could answer, Tyler called everyone together for a final briefing. Listen up. Conditions are changing every few minutes. Do not chase the wind. Trust your process. Trust your data. The students nodded. Tyler then looked directly toward Rebecca. That advice applies to everybody. Several students exchanged glances. The comment sounded harmless, but by now most of them recognized the pattern. Tyler seemed determined to prove a point. Rebecca simply nodded. Good advice. Tyler walked closer. You know, I have been thinking about your worksheet. Have you? 3 wind zones is an interesting theory. It is only an observation. An observation without verification is a guess. Rebecca looked toward the distant hillside. Sometimes. Tyler folded his arms. You keep saying things like that. Like what? Answers that sound wise without actually committing to anything. The surrounding students became very quiet. Nobody wanted to miss the exchange. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. I am sorry if it sounds that way. You do not need to apologize. Tyler smiled. I just think people learn faster when they are willing to test their ideas publicly. The challenge was obvious now. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Chris frowned. Even he could see that Tyler was pushing harder than necessary. Rebecca studied him for a moment. There was no anger in her expression. No embarrassment. If anything, she looked slightly concerned. Are you sure you want to continue this conversation? She asked softly. The question surprised several people. Tyler laughed. Why would I not? Because sometimes conversations stop being useful. A few students glanced at each other. The words were polite, but they landed with unexpected weight. Tyler interpreted them differently. To him, it sounded like retreat. Do not worry, he said. Nobody is judging you. A few nervous laughs followed. Rebecca looked down briefly and then back up. That is good. You are among professionals here. I can see that. Tyler nodded as if he had won something. Excellent. He pointed toward the firing line. Then let us see whose methods hold up. The students began moving into position. Above the range, another gust rolled through the valley. The nearest flag shifted. Then the distant ones shifted differently. Rebecca noticed immediately. So did Chris. Tyler, focused on organizing the exercise, never looked downrange. Not once. And for the first time that day, Chris found himself wondering whether the woman everyone thought was being taught might actually be the only person seeing the entire picture. The practical evaluation began with a series of individual attempts. Students moved through the firing positions one at a time, while spotters recorded observations and instructors reviewed decision-making. Nobody was being judged on perfection. The purpose was to demonstrate understanding under changing conditions. Even so, everyone wanted to perform well. The first few students produced respectable results. Some adapted effectively to the shifting wind. Others struggled when conditions changed between calculations and execution. Tyler provided commentary after each attempt, pointing out strengths and weaknesses with the confidence of someone who had spent years teaching the craft. The class listened carefully. Then Tyler stepped into position himself. A murmur spread through the group. It was not part of the schedule, but nobody objected. Most students were eager to watch the instructor demonstrate the process. Tyler settled behind the rifle and reviewed the data. He checked the display screen, studied the nearest wind indicators, and entered his adjustments. The students watched closely. Chris Donovan folded his arms and focused on the target area. Rebecca stood quietly near the rear of the group. She said nothing. Tyler completed his preparation and executed the demonstration. Several seconds later, the spotter reported the result. The outcome was respectable, but not as precise as many expected. A few students exchanged surprised looks. Tyler immediately explained the environmental factors involved. That is exactly why we teach process, he said. Conditions changed during the shot sequence. Nobody challenged the explanation. It was reasonable. But Chris noticed something else. Rebecca was looking far beyond the nearest wind flags. Her attention seemed fixed on sections of terrain that most people ignored. Tyler stood and reset the exercise. Good example, he said. The environment does not care how confident you are. The students laughed politely. Then one of them raised a hand. What about her calculation? The question immediately drew attention. Tyler glanced toward Rebecca. Right? The famous three-zone theory. More students turned to look at her. Rebecca appeared completely unbothered. It was just an observation, she said. Well, Tyler replied. Now we have an opportunity to test it. Several students smiled. The challenge was becoming impossible to ignore. Rebecca looked toward the distant ridgeline again. The wind had shifted once more. I do not think that is necessary. Tyler laughed softly. Why not? Because this is your class. Exactly. He spread his hands. And learning opportunities should not be wasted. The group became silent. Tyler believed he was being generous by offering her a chance to participate. Rebecca seemed to see something different. For several seconds, she considered the invitation. Finally, she nodded once. If you insist. Excitement moved through the students. Some stepped closer. Others immediately reached for notebooks. Chris watched Rebecca carefully. Unlike every other participant, she showed no sign of nervousness. No deep breath. No visible preparation. No attempt to prove anything. She simply walked toward the firing position as though she had done it 1,000 times before. Tyler stepped aside with a confident smile. He still expected the exercise to confirm everything he had been saying all day. What he did not realize was that several students were no longer watching Rebecca. They were watching him. And for the first time since the course began, they were wondering which person was actually about to be evaluated. Rebecca settled into the firing position with an ease that immediately caught Chris Donovan's attention. There was nothing dramatic about it. No attempt to impress the audience. No ritual designed to attract attention. She simply adjusted her posture, studied the terrain, and became very still. Around her, the students watched with growing curiosity. Tyler stood a few feet away with his arms folded. He appeared relaxed, but several people noticed that he was paying much closer attention now. Rebecca spent several moments observing the range before touching any controls. Her eyes moved from the nearest wind indicators to the distant vegetation and then toward the ridgeline beyond the target area. It was the same pattern she had been studying all afternoon. One student checked his watch. Another shifted impatiently. Tyler smiled slightly. Taking your time? Rebecca glanced toward him. The wind is still making up its mind. A few students chuckled. Tyler answered immediately. That is why we use measured data. Rebecca nodded. Sometimes. The response sounded familiar. Several students exchanged amused looks. Then she returned her attention downrange. The range grew quiet. Even the casual conversations had stopped. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Rebecca reviewed the information available to her and made a few adjustments. Her movements were precise but unhurried. There was no sign of uncertainty. Chris noticed something else. She never looked toward the audience. Most people became aware of being watched. Rebecca seemed to forget they were there. Finally, she settled behind the optic and completed her evaluation. Several seconds passed. Then the spotter reported the outcome. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned. A few students blinked in surprise. Others looked toward Tyler. The result had exceeded expectations. Not by luck. Not by chance. The calculation had accounted for conditions that many people on the range had completely overlooked. Tyler's expression changed for the first time all day. Not dramatically, just enough for people paying attention to notice. He stepped closer and reviewed the data himself. Interesting, he said. Rebecca stood and stepped away from the position. Conditions were favorable. Several students laughed softly. The understatement only made the moment more impressive. Chris shook his head. That was not favorable conditions. Rebecca smiled. They could have been worse. Tyler reviewed the figures again. He clearly expected to find a simple explanation. Instead, he found confirmation. The adjustments matched the observations she had described earlier. The 3 wind zones. The shifting patterns. The terrain effects. Every detail she had mentioned was reflected in the solution. One of the younger students looked at Rebecca with renewed curiosity. Where did you learn to read conditions like that? Before Rebecca could answer, another student suddenly froze. He was staring toward a nearby administration building overlooking the range. Wait a second, he said quietly. Nobody responded at first. The student looked back and forth between Rebecca and the building. I know that face. Chris frowned. What are you talking about? The student pointed toward the structure. Inside the lobby was a wall covered with photographs of former instructors, distinguished graduates, and legendary marksmen who had shaped the program over decades. I saw her picture in there. The group fell silent. Rebecca's expression did not change. Tyler turned slowly toward the building. The student swallowed hard. I am serious. I have seen that face before. For the first time all afternoon, nobody was paying attention to the target range. Every eye had shifted toward Rebecca Hayes. And suddenly the question was no longer whether she understood long-range shooting. The question was why her photograph might already be hanging on the wall. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected. The student who had spoken first looked increasingly certain with every passing second. "I know I have seen you before," he said. "Not somewhere on base. On that wall." Several others immediately began looking toward the administration building. Curiosity spread through the group faster than any lecture ever could. Rebecca offered no explanation. She simply stood there with the same calm expression she had carried all afternoon. Tyler glanced between her and the building. "There are hundreds of photographs in that lobby," he said. "You are probably mistaken." The student shook his head. "No. I remember because I stopped and read some of the plaques this morning." Chris Donovan narrowed his eyes. "What did the plaque say?" The student hesitated. "I do not remember everything. Just that the person was connected to one of the advanced instructor programs years ago." Before anyone could continue the discussion, a black government vehicle rolled slowly into the range parking area. The timing could not have been stranger. Conversation stopped as the vehicle came to a halt near the administration office. A tall man stepped out wearing a simple field jacket and carrying a folder under one arm. Several instructors immediately recognized him. Their posture changed at once. Tyler noticed it too. "Is that who I think it is?" one student whispered. Chris looked carefully before nodding. "Master Chief Daniel Carter." The reaction was immediate. Even students who had never met him knew the name. Daniel Carter was one of the most respected long-range shooting instructors in the military training community. His methods had influenced programs across multiple branches. Tyler himself had referenced Carter's teachings throughout the course. The Master Chief walked across the range with purposeful steps, occasionally greeting instructors along the way. Then something unexpected happened. He stopped. His attention had locked onto Rebecca Hayes. For a brief moment, he looked almost surprised. Then a broad smile appeared across his face. "Rebecca," he called out. Every person on the range turned to look at her. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. "Hello, Daniel." The familiarity instantly confused everyone. Daniel Carter crossed the remaining distance and stopped directly in front of her. Then, without hesitation, he stood perfectly straight and offered a respectful salute. The entire range froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Tyler stared in disbelief. The students looked from Carter to Rebecca and back again. Daniel lowered his hand and laughed softly. "I should have known you would show up unannounced." Rebecca shrugged. "I was passing through." "Passing through?" Daniel shook his head. "You disappear for years and call this passing through?" Several instructors nearby were now watching with expressions that bordered on amazement. Tyler could no longer hide his confusion. "Master Chief," he said carefully, "you know her?" Daniel turned toward him. "Know her?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question. Then his eyes moved back to Rebecca. "The better question is why nobody has introduced her properly." The range fell silent again. Daniel smiled and tapped the folder against his leg. "Everything I taught in my first instructor certification course came from her. Every lesson, every exercise, every standard." Tyler felt his stomach drop. Around him, students exchanged stunned looks. Daniel continued speaking. "In fact, long before I ever taught instructors, I was sitting exactly where you are now." He pointed toward the firing line. Then he looked directly at Tyler Brooks. And the person teaching the class was Rebecca Hayes. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The wind continued moving across the range. The flags continued shifting, and somewhere in the distance a vehicle door closed. But within the group gathered around the firing line, everything felt completely still. Tyler Brooks stood frozen. The statement echoed in his mind. Every lesson, every exercise, every standard. The words refused to leave. Daniel Carter looked around at the stunned faces and smiled knowingly. He had seen this reaction before. "Do not look so surprised," he said. "Half the techniques being taught in advanced programs today trace back to her work." Several students immediately turned toward Rebecca. Suddenly, every detail from the afternoon seemed different. Her calm responses, her observations about the wind, her refusal to argue, her complete lack of interest in proving herself. None of it looked the same anymore. Tyler finally found his voice. "Why did nobody tell us?" Daniel laughed softly. "Because she never tells anyone." Rebecca shook her head. There was nothing to tell. That answer only deepened the silence. Chris Donovan stared at her in disbelief. "Nothing to tell?" he said. You trained one of the most respected instructors in the military. Rebecca shrugged. Years ago. Daniel folded his arms. You are leaving out a few details. Several students leaned forward. Rebecca immediately answered before he could continue. Daniel, please. The Master Chief smiled. See? Same as always. Tyler looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. The confidence that had carried him through the entire day was gone. In its place was something else. Perspective. You tried to warn me, he said quietly. Rebecca looked at him. About what? When you asked whether I wanted to continue the conversation. A few students remembered the moment immediately. Rebecca smiled gently. I was trying to save us both time. Laughter spread through the group. Not mocking laughter. Relieved laughter. Even Tyler smiled. The tension that had followed them all afternoon finally began to disappear. I owe you an apology, he said. I made assumptions. Rebecca nodded. Everybody does. No, Tyler replied. I should have listened more and talked less. Daniel Carter pointed toward him. That lesson alone will make you a better instructor. Tyler looked around at his students. Then back at Rebecca. Would you have corrected me if Daniel had never shown up? Rebecca thought about the question. Probably not. Why? She glanced toward the distant target range where the shifting wind continued to dance across the valley. Because the goal was never to win an argument. Nobody spoke for several moments. The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any lecture they had heard all day. As the afternoon came to an end, students packed equipment and prepared to leave. Many approached Rebecca to shake her hand or thank her for the lesson she had never intended to teach. She greeted each person with the same quiet humility. Eventually, she picked up her bag and began walking toward the parking area. Daniel called after her. You are not staying for dinner? Rebecca smiled over her shoulder. I am just passing through, remember? Daniel laughed. You always say that. Tyler watched her leave. The woman he had spent an entire day trying to teach had once taught the instructor he admired most. Yet she had never mentioned it, never used it, never needed it. Long after her vehicle disappeared beyond the gate, the lesson remained. Real expertise rarely announces itself. Real confidence does not demand recognition. And real respect is not earned by proving others wrong. It is earned by having nothing left to prove.